Hardly any food and too often no home. Yeah, many British children live in extreme poverty, but politicians have been ignoring the problem for decades, including Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. But ultimately, hope remains. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and his Chancellor of the Exchequer are promising the public what should have come years ago. A U-turn in the country's economic health, perhaps a higher standard of living. And anyone who comes to the magnificent city centre of London and the southeast of the country will indeed get the wrong impression here, of course. Because this is where the concentrated wealth lies, not only all of those who work in the City of London, but all of those families who left their home countries because of corruption, war and unrest, and with their capital flight settled in the democratic constitutional security of the United Kingdom. Sarcasm off. But in the northwest of the country, the kingdom's old industrial belt, as well as the former port areas in East London, things look very different. More than 30% of children there live in relative poverty. In Birmingham, Leicester, Nottingham and Manchester, it is around 40%. And this means that these are children from families who cannot afford anything close to what a normal standard of living would entail. And according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the average household income, the median income, rose from £30,000 to £32,305 during the 14 years of the Tory government. God beware 40. In households with children, it's only £28,160, just under €33,000, because usually not both spouses can work, and households with children in relative poverty do not even generate a household income of the equivalent of €20,000 per year. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation has calculated that more than 4 million children live in these poor conditions, and according to government figures, 3.175 million children live in absolute poverty, and this means they cannot even afford daily food or buy necessary clothing or new shoes. Many children in absolute poverty do not even have a home, that means social housing. They have to move from shelter to shelter at the state's expense. The proportion of poverty is particularly high in immigrant cultures, many of whom come from Pakistan and Bangladesh, India, China and the Caribbean. It is a question of slow integration, language difficulties and associated professional obstacles, inadequate training and the frequent pressure on women to stay at home because of the large number of children and thus not being able to contribute to the household income. Especially women from a Caribbean or African cultural background often have to raise their children alone, an extreme burden despite hard work, and it's a disastrous cycle. But traditional white working class families are also trapped in poverty. Some of them have been without a job for decades and are dependent on government support. In the old industrial cities of the north, there are entire streets on the dole, as they say, and dependent on government help in the event of illness, for example. Since the state limited many social welfare benefits to 2 children, poverty in large families has increased. It's not uncommon to observe the phenomenon that parents buy their children a few bags of crisps and a Coke for breakfast in the next morning in the store next door, as well as cigarettes, a lottery ticket and beer for themselves, and maybe a pizza for the evening, and anything else would be too expensive. Since the COVID pandemic, there has also been a noticeable increase in mental illnesses in rural areas. In the UK, 16 million people are now registered as disabled, meaning they are considered impaired in some way, including 5.4 million as a result of mental illness, stress and anxiety. Around 2.8 million working-age Brits are not working because they are on long-term sickness. There are enough vacancies on the market. It's probably a result of mental stress, the lockdowns, the poor working conditions, and the poverty that people cannot cope with. Many may no longer have the strength to force themselves to work. However, in order to receive state aid, it is now easier to get a doctor's note for mental illnesses than to prove that you have a physical illness. The Secretary of State Mel Stride recently warned that people with mild mental illnesses should be encouraged to work, at least from home. The state cannot bear the billions for aid in the long term. At 22.1% of the gross domestic product, the British state pays even less for the welfare state than the United States, and in contrast to my home country Germany, even less than before the corona pandemic. And the misery is actually due to politics. The country has been suffering for decades from poor vocational education and universities that are too expensive. There's too low productivity and competitiveness in the economy, regardless of the City of London. It took 7 years after the financial crisis for living standards to recover. It then rose until the corona pandemic, but has since fallen back to the 2018 level, according to the government. Average real wages in the country have stagnated for years. Productivity growth has fallen 24% since 2005, according to the Economic and Social Research Council. Germany's economic power, which is spread across several metropolitan areas in the country, is also largely concentrated in one point, including policies that are very focused on the economic interests, like they do in London with the English. But it's not Rishi Sunak's fault that his government is left with the shambles of 14 years of Tory politics. It's not even the Tories' fault that the Labour government voted out in 2010 rested on the economic success of the City of London and the supposed future of the services sector, and did too little to spread economic growth and prosperity across the country. But it is to the credit of the Conservative Party that after coming to power in 2010, they imposed a draconian austerity course on the country following the exorbitantly expensive financial crisis, from which the public sector, including the authorities, the health sector and the training sector, have not recovered to this day. However, if patients cannot be treated in the health sector because they are on waiting lists, they cannot work and become mentally ill and unstable. After the Tories' austerity drive, the major distraction of Brexit came in 2016, which made any halfway normal politics impossible until it was implemented in 2020, given the tumult in the House of Commons and the uncertainty about the country's future course. And so many governments, prime ministers, and thus economic concepts changed that well thought out long-term policies were not feasible. And this is the real damage of Brexit. As soon as Brexit formally came into force, the corona pandemic paralyzed the country. And then Sunak came to power, but there was no time left. The state now has so little money that the next government will have to save money again. The country's tax burden has risen to record levels, as have the interest payments that the state has to make on its drastically higher debt. And pseudo issues like the Rwanda deportation policy were intended to inspire voters, which has not worked to date. The public has long recognized that the country's real problems have not been addressed in 14 years, and that another government must try to do so in the next few years. That's why the public no longer listens when Sunak promises that the economic situation will improve by the fall, that inflation will continue to fall, that interest rates will fall, that everything will be right with the world of the British again. The country's best-known election expert, that's John Curtis, recently said he was 99% certain that the Conservatives would be voted out in the autumn and Labour would come to power. Poverty in the country, including child poverty, will also have to wait that long. They were long lost years. And if Starmer doesn't start to repair the Brexit damage, he will have not a lot of leeway of dealing with that. It's not only the long lost time. I told you that Brexit took a lot of time and focus away from everything. But Brexit has, yes, formally happened, but Brexit is long not over. And everyone who watches my channel knows that. And Labour has to deal with that as well, and has to deal with that quickly to reduce the damage of Brexit and to get the focus finally on real long-term daily politics in the United Kingdom. And I am with Curtis. no matter what happens within the Conservative Party, even if they, with a miracle, would come back to being a normal Conservative Party, like I wish they would, then I would support them. And I'm quite sure they will lose the next general election to Labour. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.